Welcome to the Sheffield Sunday As Bill Sees It meeting. This is a main share meeting, and today it is with great pleasure and much gratitude that we welcome Herb Kay from California, who's come to share for about 40 minutes, after which we'll open up for general sharing or if you'd like to ask a question. Thank you, Herb. It's wonderful to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for chairing the meeting and to Sung for inviting me to join you. My name is Herb, and I'm an alcoholic, and my sobriety date is February 21st, 1984. I've been at this for a while. And I want to talk about step 11, and I will. The reading really talks about the primary assumption of step 11, and that is steps 2 and 3. It's interesting to me, when I look back over my shoulder at my journey, I was given the gift of sobriety in February of 1984. I didn't go to AA for 3 months. It's a story for a different day. It's not important, actually. Generally, to me it is. And when I went to AA, I learned I was an alcoholic, and I began my journey getting a sponsor, and that's a story for a different day. But for 5 years, I had that sponsor. I called him every day. I went to a meeting every day. I worked the steps on my own, which was his instruction. Read the book and work the steps. I don't recommend that. Although it was my experience, and I survived it. It was probably unnecessarily difficult because I can't read the big book. I'm reasonably intelligent, fairly well educated. But I couldn't read the English language big book and understand it. Now, I didn't know that. I was in book studies and step studies for those 5 years. And I thought I knew, but I didn't know that I didn't know, and I couldn't see that I didn't see. That's my journey. It's not poetic, it's not cute, it's just trying to capture my journey. And to those maybe who similarly have had difficulty or currently are a little bit confused or lost, or they haven't changed, or their life is wonky in some fashion. At 5 years of sobriety, 1988, I engaged him as a step guide. It's a term you won't find much or hear much in the rooms. But it's my term for him because he wasn't my sponsor. He wasn't my friend. I didn't even know him when I invited him to help me. Again, that's a story for a different day. I don't want to get distracted. I want to focus on step 11. And he took me through the steps out of the big book, giving me an understanding of each step and how to apply it to my personal life. And I had the experience that's promised. Right in the 12th step, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. Now, I didn't know or could not have articulated all of this at the time. I was experiencing it. That radical change in the way I thought and felt and behaved. I had been exposed to a big commitment to formal religion, a big commitment and lots of time and money and experience with therapy. And all the human development kinds of programs that were available in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. But I had not ever experienced what I experienced in going through the steps this time, back in 1988. It took a year to go through the steps. That's just my experience. And I finished step 9, and he gave me the instructions on step 11. And I began practicing step 11 for the very first time. Now, part of my journey was a 7-year experience of being a monk. I was in a monastery from 17 to 24. No drinking. There wasn't alcohol available. But before and after, I could see from my own history several efforts at understanding my own autobiography and my relationship with alcohol, that when I began, I couldn't stop, and when I stopped, I couldn't stay stopped. And I'm clearly an alcoholic by anybody's definition. It wasn't the drama that made me an alcoholic. Drunk driving arrests and hospitalizations and problems at work and problems at home. Anybody who does anything to the intensity and the compulsion that I did will probably have problems in their life. The drama doesn't make me an alcoholic. What makes me an alcoholic is my relationship with alcohol, my experience with alcohol. And he helped me see step one very clearly, and I had an experience for the very first time understanding why I was an alcoholic, what made it so. Not drama, but biology and psychology, an allergy that produces a craving, an obsession that produces a compulsion, and that I don't have power. I had mouthed the words powerless. I heard it in the meetings. I read it into step, and I mouthed it for 5 years without really understanding it. I thought it was the drama, and it's not. It's my genetics and the way I think. Fred, in his little story there, I think around page 40, talks about a strange mental blank spot, and it captured my experience. I did steps 2 and 3. I told you I was a monk for 7 years. So I had no problem with the whole God thing and the whole meditation thing. But what happened when he took me to step 11, after finishing steps 4 through 10 and understanding that those were the steps that addressed the darkness, 4 through 10, identified and removed the darkness. And so I was able to understand and begin to practice step 11, guidance in the light. He said, read it. Step 11 in the big book. And as I've come to evaluate it now because of my practice of it, I think it's the most effective description of meditation, how to do it and why to do it, that I've ever seen. And I studied 7 years in a monastery and practiced 7 years in a monastery. But at the end of 7 years, 1964, I hung up my black robe and I didn't meditate again for another 25 years. What's that? Well, that's a person who's sincere, who, when they put on a black robe, is a monk, and monks meditate. And when they take the black robe off, they are not a monk, so they don't meditate. Who didn't understand what it was, why you do it, etc., etc. So I didn't do it. And this man had me read it. Then he had me look up the definition of meditation in a big book, in a dictionary. I encourage you to do that. Most of us do not really understand what meditation is. In the big book, there's many definitions, but Bill had a specific experience, and I knew that later from doing some reading in the history. I'm a dilettante in all of these areas. But he was in the Oxford group, which was a Christian group. It had nothing to do with alcoholics. In fact, I didn't even like alcoholics. But they made an exception for Roland Hazard, who came to them as a millionaire, and they wanted his Rolodex. They wanted his contact with other millionaires. So they said, okay, come in. You're a drunk. We don't like drunks. But apply these 6 steps and see what happens. And what happens is he had a spiritual awakening, and he got free from his alcohol. And he met and reached out to Evie Thatcher, another millionaire. Evie got sober, and he reached out to Bill, and the rest is history, of course. So in the Oxford group, they meditated to get guidance. That was the sole purpose. The word's not used in the big book. I'm not sure it's in the 12 and 12. Both very good descriptions of Bill's understanding and experience with meditation. But I looked it up in a dictionary. Meditation, the use of the mind to think. There's some confusion in the rooms about meditation. And you hear words like distance from the mind, no thought, no thinking, emptiness, silence. No, I'm sorry, wrong. I mean, it couldn't be more wrong. Meditation. Prayer, and you've heard it in the rooms, I'm sure. Meditation is when you're talking to God, and prayer is when you're talking to God, and meditation is when you're listening to God. Very simplistic, but deep wisdom. Prayer is when I'm attempting to have a conversation, an intimacy to establish a relationship. Meditation is when, in fact, I'm listening to get guidance. Isn't that what the step 11 says? Precisely. Sought. Very active, not passive. Ferociously active, meaning awake and thinking, sought through prayer and meditation, talking and listening, to God as we understand it. I prefer these days, it happened about 5 years ago, I've been at this for a long time, 5 years ago, and I don't understand God, so I changed the phrase. God is, I don't understand it. I don't understand God. I want to have a knowledge of and an interpretation of and a relationship with. That's all come about because I did the steps again after that first effort, which was successful. I had the change, but I had no relationship with steps 2 and 3. I blew by them. And again, in 1991, 3 years later, I blew by them. Steps 2 and 3. Don't you know I'm a monk? I mean, I've read and studied philosophy and theology, and I know some spiritual stuff. Well, I mean, that was the prejudice I had. I hadn't really listened to nor understood the instructions or suggestions on page 58 of letting go of your old ideas, and it's peppered throughout the big book. I didn't hear it, I didn't apply it, I didn't understand it, I didn't embrace it. And a man at 10 years of sobriety, my third journey through the steps. I'm saying it this way not to impress you with my history at all, but to indicate to you this is a process. It's not one and, for me, it's not one and done. It's a process of becoming conscious, like a dimmer switch goes up a notch at a time, and the lights get brighter a notch at a time because there's more electricity, there's more power in the line. That's my journey. Coming from the darkness of addiction to freedom from addiction, and then coming from the darkness of unmanageability to the freedom of manageability. In 1988, I had a conversion experience, a transformation experience where I saw that, I need to manage my life. That's the invitation. God does not manage my life. That's not the implication in the big book as I understood it, as I continue to understand it. I have an invitation to manage my life. Although I need to quit playing God, the counsel in step 3. I need to take responsibility for my thoughts and my feelings and my actions. I am not a victim. I'm the perpetrator. I am not a victim. I am 100% responsible for my reactions to reality. Now, that was the door that opened in 1988, but it didn't swing all the way open for 10 to 20 years. My fourth time going through the steps at 20 years confirmed that the door had swung open and that I was living in and walking in and having an improved relationship with and an enlarged capacity for light. I use those words very carefully. Improve my consciousness and enlarge my capacity. That word enlarge comes from page 14. We perfect and enlarge our spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others. That was the reason Bill gives us in Jim's story, page 37, for his relapse. He failed to enlarge his spiritual life. He had a spiritual life, but he didn't reach out and share it with anybody else. And thank you for the reading, both of the steps and the traditions. Each person did it very intelligently and articulately. People could hear it if they were listening, because it's the formula for our recovery. The steps will give us consciousness, and the traditions as we carry it, especially tradition 5. The purpose of this meeting is to carry the message to another person. What message is that? Oh, that you can have an awakening as the result of these steps. I start my work with any individual these days with step 12, Spiritual Awakening Appendix 2. Well, it's a change that happened about 10, 15 years ago when I thought, there's a lot of people that stop doing the steps in the 4th step. I do workshops on a weekly basis, and I lose half of the people in the 4th step. And it's sad, it's tragic. But it is what is. And so I thought, well, what would motivate them? Well, maybe they should have a very clear understanding right at the beginning what the purpose of the steps are. It's not about addiction. Bill says it in the big book. Addiction is the presenting problem. Addiction is the reason of our suffering, that we come to a 12-step program and attempt to embrace it, suffering. But suffering and fear will not keep us here. I wonder what Bill means when he says on page 84, not cured daily reprieve. He promises on 84 neutrality with regard to our addiction. But he also suggests that we're not cured. Of what? My speculation is of unmanageability. Not cured of unmanageability. We have a daily reprieve from our unmanageability. Page 62, selfishness, self-centeredness is the root of our unmanageability that manifests in resentment and fear and dishonesty, as represented certainly in my sexual behavior and history. So I mentioned that in 1988, this man took me through the steps and taught me about meditation, those 2.5 pages in the big book. And he said, read it and highlight it, and then reread it and outline it. And he got that from the big book on at the end of the chapter, page 80, 81, something like that, where it says, we're undisciplined. So we let God discipline us in the way we have just outlined. So he said, outline step 11. And I did. It tells us what to do at night. Now, why would Bill start with the night? No, I have my answer to the question. He has just delivered to us the formula for dealing with our darkness in the daytime. And the 12 and 12 has a wonderful commentary about step 10 that clarifies the use of step 10. It's not a formula to be used at night. It's not a formula to be done in writing. Well, I mean, it doesn't matter what you do, but I'm just saying in the spirit of and the intention of, as I read it and interpret it, step 10. He says in the 12 and 12, it's a spiritual axiom. Whenever I'm disturbed, there's something wrong with me. I have just finished the 9th step. I now have the counsel to live our way of life. I commenced this way of life, page 84. As we cleaned up the past, we've entered the world of the spirit. Where have we been? I've been in the world of self, steps 1 through 9. And now I've had the turnaround, a term from Katie Byron, Byron Katie, loving what is. Not a 12-step, not a psychologist, but she's had a spiritual experience of awakening in her own fashion, and she calls it the turnaround. I've adopted the word for my experience with column 3 and column 4. Again, I didn't have the experience all in one lump. I had the experience of column 4 the first time that I went through the steps, and then 3 years later had the experience with column 3. Again, confirming that this is a process of progress, not an event or an experience. Although there are experiences during the journey, of course, meaning very powerful, phenomenal experiences that we can, in fact, articulate and relish and remember, but they don't last. But the awakening does, very slow, like the dimmer switch. The experience is kind of like the light switch. It goes on and it goes off. But the awakening, my metaphor for it is the dimmer switch. It goes up a notch at a time. And there's more light, and there's more light, and there's more light. Now, at 10 years of sobriety, the man took me through the steps. I call him a step guide. None of them ever became my friend or my sponsor. They were like project managers. I engaged them to take me through the steps. And when I was finished with the steps, we each went our own way. The first time was a year. The second time was 6 months. I was in a hurry. Again, stories for different days. And the third time, it took 2 years. I had no hot poker at my back, but I knew that there was some type of magnetic light in front of me that was inviting me. And I knew in the heart of hearts, there was more. Not as clearly as I'm articulating it today, but it was what motivated me to ask this man to help me. And he helped me understand unmanageability, but first he taught me about the set-aside attitude and the set-aside prayer. Many of you have heard of it. Many of you have not. It's not a formal prayer. It's not even articulated this way in the Big Book or the 12 and 12, but it is indicated right in How It Works, chapter 5, page 58. Are you willing to let go of your old ideas? And he said to me, you've got a tremendous understanding of the Big Book. You've had a powerful spiritual awakening twice now with the step process. And this is him acknowledging it to me. He says, and to the extent that you hold on that knowledge and that experience, you're prohibited from having any new knowledge or experience. Brilliant. But he did quote Einstein. The consciousness that created the problem cannot be the consciousness that solves the problem. The mind is the problem. So the mind can't produce a solution because any solution the mind has will embed the problem in the solution. It made total sense to me. My version of it on a spontaneous and impromptu basis, because I've never been able to memorize any form of the set-aside prayer, and I don't want to. Prayer is not about words. Prayer is about intention. What is my intention? My intention is to have a conversation. My intention is to have a relationship. My short little version that I can remember. Holy Spirit, release me from up till now. Detach me from after now. And allow me to be fully conscious in the present, in the now. And I pray that prayer every morning. And then the third step prayer from the book on page 63. My commitment to have a relationship. Step 1 is my experience that I need help. Step 2 is that help's available. And I didn't know that until this third journey through the steps. And he asked me a couple of questions, and you might want to jot them down if you haven't asked and processed these 2 questions, because it opened up the door to a relationship with a power that I do not understand, but that I believe is. That's the definition of faith. And Bill tells us that on page 53. God is or God isn't, what is your choice? I'm quoting. God is or God isn't, what is your choice? We are confronted with the question of faith. I'm quoting. So I confronted myself, and this man asked me, write out what you believe about God. I didn't just hiccup. Write out what you believe. Write it out. A sentence, a paragraph, a page. And a week later he gave me, because I did that and I read it to him, and he said, oh my gosh, it's theologically very sound, philosophically very well put, poetically, it's like you should publish it, Herb. And I don't know whether that was tongue or cheek or not. But anyway, then he gave me the second question a week later. You wrote what you believe. Now write out, how do you behave? And I knew right away that there was going to be an experience and a challenge here. I just intuitively knew it, and I spent some time in prayer and meditation because I had had fourth step experiences previously. So I knew my own history of behavior, my motives, my beliefs, my delusional beliefs, and my corrupt motives. I had seen those embarrassingly so much that it had opened me up and allowed me to change in step 6 and 7. Powerless, step 6. Confirmed in step 7 of prayer to change. I don't work on my character defects, but I work in the behavior connected to my character defects. I learned that in my first journey through the steps. I am responsible for my behavior, but I am powerless over the inclination to my behavior. That's not a subtle distinction. I can pray to have the inclination and the behavior changed. And this man added a component to it. He said, and call me every day to tell me how you're doing. It's not in the big book or the 12 and 12. Prayer, that's step 7, of course. Addressing specifically the character defect, both its origin, inclination, instincts gone awry, and its manifestation in behavior. And then he said, and call me every day. That was the key that unlocked the door to my personal change. Reporting it. Now, that could be just good psychology and peer pressure. It doesn't matter. Within 48 hours, the behavior changed, and it took 2 years for the inclination to change. This stuff really works. I'm not sure how it works because I've never solved the problem of willingness and grace. A problem in my head, anyway. I need to be willing. Bill says that on page 47. It's the cornerstone of the spiritual arch through which we walk to a new freedom. Again, I'm quoting. Willingness is the cornerstone. But this man made it very clear to me, this first man taking me through the steps, willingness without action is fantasy. He had these kind of wisdom sayings that just pierced the armor of my denial and my defense. Willingness without action is fantasy. Take the action and then report. So when I answered the question, how do I behave? It was very embarrassing in relationship to my understanding and what I thought was my belief. I didn't believe it at all. I was a practical agnostic. At 10 years of sobriety, having had 2 powerful spiritual awakenings and practicing daily prayer and meditation. All of that is all just a piece of work. And it gets deeper, and the dimmer switch goes up, and the lights get brighter, and I become more conscious of my being unconscious. And quite frankly, that never stops. I'm 41 years sober, and I still wake up periodically to the fact that I was asleep, dreaming that I was awake, to use a phrase from Gurdjieff, a Russian spiritual teacher. He said, all human beings are asleep, dreaming they're awake. Oh, God, I love that. And I stay gently pressed up, this God of my not understanding. And I had this turnaround, the third journey through the steps. In step 2, God is or God isn't. That's my faith choice. He says, what is your choice? And then in step 3, he asks us to make a decision. Now, he doesn't say it this way, or you might already get that I'm fairly analytical. What's the difference between a choice in step 2 and a decision in step 3? I don't know, but I make stuff up. The choice is the act of my will. God is. The decision is the implementation and commitment of that willpower to action. Steps 4 through 10. A commitment to have a relationship. Faith is that there is something to have a relationship with. Step 3 is the reach out, the building the bridge, the leap from the edge of the cliff to the bridge to the shore of faith. Now, not having that experience didn't prevent me from having a robust meditation practice from the very first journey through the steps. Because this man had me outline it, and it says, we ask God upon awakening, we ask God to direct our thinking. And this man very clearly, he doesn't allow me to make stuff up based on, he wants me to understand at least what he understands. We ask God. He said, that's a prayer. And it goes like this. God, please open my mind and open my heart. Upon awakening, we ask God to direct our thinking. God, please direct my thinking. And that's what the dictionary said meditation is, directed thinking. The understanding in the Western culture got, I believe, a bit corrupted, unintentionally, by the people who came over from the East in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, Tibet, Japan, India, China, etc. And they talked about silence and distance from the mind and no thinking. And they were talking about contemplation. Another spiritual practice of consciousness. I've incorporated it into my personal practice. It's not in the Big Book or the 12 and 12. It's implied. I believe Bill understood it, but he didn't write much about it. He's talking about meditation to get guidance. We ask God to direct our thinking. That's a prayer. Then the Big Book says we begin thinking. Think about the 24 hours ahead. Consider your plans for the day. 2 suggestions. Bill is a classic writer in the English language, and he doesn't like to repeat himself. He was asked one time on tape, what's the difference between a shortcoming and a character defect in step 6 and 7? And he just laughed. He said, oh, there's no difference. He said, I was taught in my classic English training that you don't use the same word or phrase in consecutive sentences. They're the same. Well, that clarified it for me, but it also clarified the way Bill approaches it. So if, in fact, he has 2 phrases, think about the 24 hours ahead, consider your plans, perhaps they're 2 different instructions. And that's the way I interpret it anyway. One is, think about the 24 hours ahead. What's your actions going to be? Consider your plans for the days. So who are you going to be today? What were your character defects yesterday that you would like to address in prayer and accountability today? Think and consider. But here's what's not in the Big Book. Here's what's not in the 12 and 12. And this was the key. I didn't know it at the time. This was the key. This man gave it to me. He wasn't trained, but it was his experience. We pray for guidance. That's what step 11 says, doesn't it? Knowledge of your will for me and the power to do it. The antidote to unmanageability. Unmanageability could be defined as I know better, but I don't do better. I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. the complaint in the Christian scripture by St. Paul. I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I want to do. Unmanageability. Read page 60 to 62, a perfect description of unmanageability in the big book. And this man said, the big book asks us to asks us to think and consider. He said, and I suggest that you listen to your thinking and you listen to your consideration as a direct response to your prayer. God, please direct my thinking, begin thinking, and listen to your thinking. I've never heard God speak to me audibly through my ears, but I've heard that tiny whispering sound, that wee small voice in my heart, in my intuition, in my instincts, as guidance. Listen is the word that changed my relationship with meditation. And I haven't missed a day of meditation since, because I listened February of 1989 when I finished the 9th step and began practicing 10, 11, and 12, our way of life and our way of living. And I've read some more things, and I've incorporated some more things, and I have a daily robust practice. I have a website with some material on it, and herbk.com, and I have a YouTube channel with some recordings of some teachings on meditation and prayer and contemplation. I have incorporated what the folks from the East have talked about in terms of no thought and sitting in the presence, aware of the presence. Bill knew it. I mean, read Appendix 2 very carefully. Awareness of the presence of God is the essence of a spiritual experience. I'm quoting. Awareness of the presence of God is the essence of a spiritual experience. That awareness is a contemplative process. There's no thought. There's no feeling. There's no words. There's merely this awareness that there is a power, and I can be gently pressed up against it, and in fact am. Step 2 is a commitment, is an act of faith. I am in constant contact. It's a play on words. In step 2, I am in constant contact, surrounded by and saturated in this power deep inside me, page 55. And step 3 is the hope and expectation that I can have a relationship with this power. A relationship that will give me knowledge of what to do, guidance. And then the power to do it, the strength. The knowledge to feed my mind with information. And the strength to give me the ability to make the decision and take the action and to live in grace for transformation. This man originally in 1988 said, Herb, you have a lot of information, but you have very little transformation. You've not had your academic knowledge, even about the big book and the step process. You've not had that knowledge filter through your heart to your feet, and you have not changed. He said, you think you're a Renaissance man? And I did. He said, you're a Neanderthal. And I knew that I was in for a real ride, because he didn't spare my feelings. He wasn't trying to embarrass me. He wasn't trying to shame me. He was trying to wake me up. Cold water in the face was what it was. An invitation to lean gently into this process. A process that's very uncomfortable. A process that creates suffering in the best of senses, in the healing senses. A process of forgiveness. By the end of the 9th step, where I make a decision to release them from the harm that I have done. And paradoxically, like the St. Francis prayer and the Lord's Prayer says, I am released. Forgiveness. Watch my hand. Look it up in a dictionary. a process of forgiveness, a process of release. It begins with step 4. I believe it ends with step 9. A process, a progress of awakening so that I bring healing to other people, and in that paradoxical process, I become healed. Well, that's a lot. And meditation is about thinking in the milieu of prayer. Meditation is the thinking in the milieu of prayer, and that sounds like I'm done. And fortunately, I am. Um, so if there are questions, I enjoy that part also. Thanks for inviting me to share my knowledge and my experience.